Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the third and final recording of our Reconstruction material. This will take us through some of the sort of final years of Reconstruction, but also deals with some of the pretty significant issues surrounding race relations and the question of enshrining equality and legal rights in the Constitution. And so it's going to have some interesting kinds of things to say about that. I do want to apologize again, as I have in the past. I've got a cat down here with me, and so he naturally expects that all the attention should be paid to him. And so if you hear some crying and scrambling, and if I have to pause in order to extract him from a place that he shouldn't be, I apologize for that. So, okay, so I hope everybody's doing well. Let me know if you've got questions about the full PowerPoints on Blackboard or about anything else in the class, and I will certainly do my best to help answer those questions or concerns. So, without further ado, let's get started with the last material on Reconstruction. So we talked in previous sections about what Reconstruction was. We talked about the transitions between wartime Reconstruction and presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction, and those kinds of things. One of the central issues that has to be addressed during this little over 10-year period is the issue of race relations. So in 1862-63, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in territory, as he calls it, in rebellion. So this means the Confederacy. But this is not going to be the permanent destruction of slavery in the United States. That is actually going to take place with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is ratified, making it official, in December of 1865, which means that it happens about 6 months or so after Lincoln's assassination. And this does nothing more than end slavery as an institution, right? So it's not dealing with the questions of equality. It's not dealing with questions of legal rights or opportunities in jobs or discrimination or any of those kinds of things. But slavery is founded largely on and is sort of a foundational aspect to the issues of white supremacy and racial superiority that exist in Southern society. And so Southerners recognize that the destruction of slavery is not just an economic issue, it's also an issue dealing with centuries of racial discrimination and racial inequality that have been enshrined in the Southern way of life. And so a lot of what happens during Reconstruction in terms of race relations is an attempt by white Southerners to retain or recreate as much of that racial inequality that existed under slavery as they possibly can. From an economic standpoint, these are large farms that now are not going to be based on slave labor. And so some kind of replacement solution has to be found where all of the work that had been done by enslaved peoples is now going to be done by people with as little sort of hourly wages or salaried pay as possible, because that's really an essential component for making large farms like plantations economically viable. So the solution that they come up with in southern states is what's called sharecropping. And sharecropping is basically, I will let you live on my land without paying rent. And basically, the rent payments come out of the crops that you're growing for me. And if you are buying any kind of machinery or tools, or if you're buying any kind of seeds or anything like that, you can buy it from me, and I will take the cost of that out of the crops that you are growing as well. You probably won't have a lot of extra crop to sell for pocket money. So what they're doing in sharecropping is, in many ways, recreating a system that's similar to a slave economy, but legally doesn't involve, owning a person. But in reality, sharecroppers don't have a lot of opportunities to leave. They don't have a lot of their own freedoms. And so it is a very restrictive kind of setup. And it actually exists in some parts of rural southern states all the way into the 1960s. So it's not something that is limited to the years just after the war. The other issue that emerges as a result of these changing race relations is the legal status of African Americans. And so southern states and counties begin to implement or kind of resurrect what are known as black codes. And black codes are laws that were designed to restrict the legal freedoms and legal rights that African Americans have. The federal government in the 1860s, early 1870s, is creating federal laws that are designed to open certain doors and open certain opportunities and offer certain legal protections to African Americans. The black codes are a reaction to that. Basically, they say, we will go right up to the very edge of what federal law requires and restrict everything up to that boundary. Oftentimes, these laws are worse in the rural South. So urban areas in southern states tend to be a little bit more open. They tend to be a little bit more, well, we're all in this together and we don't really have a lot of options. And so rural communities tend to enforce these a little bit worse. There's also the fact that this is partially the idea that says if there weren't laws like this, that African Americans, freed slaves, wouldn't be doing work otherwise, because otherwise they're lazy or they're reluctant or resistant to the idea of being productive members of society, or they're too stupid to be productive members of society. All kinds of really basic racist stereotypes that are being used to say, well, we're doing this for the good of the community because without laws like this, those people won't work. And so again, it's taking those kinds of prejudices and racist beliefs and reimagining them or reapplying them in the absence of slavery. And so things that the black codes will do, for instance. So legally speaking, African Americans have the right to get married now, for the first time, an official binding legal marriage contract. And so black codes, Southerners will say, well, okay, fine, we can't stop them from getting married, but what we will do is we will make sure that they won't be able to marry outside of the race. No intermarriage. Yeah, okay, they can, enter into civil cases, right? Lawsuits. Great. They can bring a lawsuit, they can sue somebody for a breach of contract or whatever. That's fine. We can't stop them from that. What we can do, though, is we can prevent them from being allowed to sit on juries. Right? And so you're creating these different kinds of boundaries within the rights that blacks are being granted and being provided with, the protections that they're finally being ensured, but you're making sure that those protections are as restricted as possible, right, while still being within the bounds of federal law. I should point out also that there are a lot of similar kinds of laws in northern states. So it's not as though the South is this backwards, reactionary kind of place, and the North is all positive and progressive and forward-thinking. It's not that at all. There are a lot of cases in northern states where there are similarly restrictive laws, but they're not enforced as stringently, and the general social situation in northern states doesn't tend to involve the same level of violence that we see between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans, that we have in southern states. So what we end up having then is this kind of leapfrog situation where the federal government will establish one sort of goalpost for race relations or racial issues and civil rights. And then states and localities in the South will come right up to that and create as much restriction within those boundaries as possible. And so the federal government will then come up with a new plan for expanding civil rights. And so a lot of this is powered by the radical Republicans, right? Those Republicans who, by and large, are more committed to expanding race relations, improving race relations, expanding civil rights and equality than their opponents, or even in some cases, other members of the Republican Party. And so they see the black codes as, well, if the South is going to do this, we're going to have to create some kind of larger solution that will ensure that those rights will be protected without question. And this ends up creating a very fascinating amendment, which is ratified in July of 1868. The 14th Amendment is one of the most important constitutional amendments of them all. There are 27 different amendments. And the most famous are probably the first and the second, right? First is freedom of speech and religion and right to assemble and freedom of press. Second, obviously, is the issue of gun ownership, right? The right to bear arms. The 14th Amendment, though, actually has a direct impact on virtually everybody's everyday life in one way or another. What it does is it says anybody born in the United States is guaranteed the protection of equality under the law. And it's designed to say, okay, South, you're creating these black codes designed to restrict civil rights. We are going to kind of use the nuclear option, right? We, the federal government, by way of installing this into the Constitution, we are going to create a constitutional amendment that guarantees that a person's rights cannot be restricted or violated for any reason. It obviously doesn't work as intended, and a great example of that is the separate but equal policy, because the 14th Amendment is used as the centerpiece of two completely opposite court decisions regarding separate but equal. So in 1896, the Supreme Court makes a ruling in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that says, as long as the different facilities for whites and blacks are equal, it's perfectly fine to have segregation, right? So as long as both white schools and black schools have equal facilities as long as both white water fountains and black water fountains function and provide water that isn't unhealthy, as long as parts of railroad cars, right, are equally safe and equally maintained. Any aspect of segregation, according to the decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, any aspect of segregation is acceptable as long as it is quote unquote equal, right? As long as those facilities are equal. And this is based on the 14th Amendment. In 1896, the court says the 14th Amendment says equal protection, and they interpret that to mean this kind of application, right? Equal facilities can be fine even if they're separated and segregated. By the mid-20th century, especially a case like Brown versus the Board of Education, the 14th Amendment is pointed to as the core philosophy behind ending segregation. Because here they say anytime you separate one race from another, anytime you require one group of people to function in a different sphere from another group of people, that is by its very nature unequal. And so the 14th Amendment is a fascinating example of the way that a constitutional amendment can be reinterpreted, right, reimagined in a variety of different ways. And in some cases, like in the case of segregation, it can be reinterpreted and reimagined in exactly opposite ways based on the very same terminology, right, the very same concepts in each case. So the 14th Amendment was supposed to solve this problem forever. It obviously doesn't. There still have to be other constitutional amendments. There have to be other federal laws that have to be passed in order to get closer and closer and closer to that ultimate goal of equality for all people. But it is, at the time, seen as a step in that direction, and at the time, it's thought to be kind of a permanent and all-inclusive solution to that issue. Certainly, Southerners are not thrilled with the idea of racial equality, and they begin to organize either informally or formally into groups that are designed to protect, from their perspective, protect their traditional rights of racial superiority, right? Racial separation and racial hierarchies. And so probably the most infamous, the most famous of these is the KKK, right? The Klan. It's created in December of 1865. Not a coincidence that December of 1865 is also when the 13th Amendment is ratified, right? The amendment that once and for all abolishes slavery forever. So it's not coincidence that the KKK is formed right at the same time. It's formed in Tennessee by 6 men who had been officers in the Confederate Army. Originally, it is designed to be anti-Republican, right? Lots of Republicans are moving into southern states to influence southern politics. Because of Lincoln, because of the radical Republicans, because of the war, because of the amendment, lots and lots and lots of African Americans side with the Republican Party. That's an alliance or an affiliation that lasts really up into the 1930s. Today, generally speaking, the black vote is more in the direction of the Democratic Party. But that's a result of changes in constituencies and things that grow out of the New Deal in the 1930s. So between the Civil War and the 1930s, African Americans tended to vote and support pretty solidly the Republican Party. And so the KKK saw itself as not just a racist terrorist organization. It will rapidly grow into that. But it sees itself initially as much as an entity designed to protect Southern traditions from outside influences, right? And those outside influences certainly included and were focused on Republicans. Certainly they included then anybody that wasn't white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. So if you were black, if you were Jewish, if you were Catholic, if you were Republican, by the 20th century, that starts to include the Latino and Latina population. It includes Asians. It includes Muslims. Anybody that was deemed to be a threat to the kind of ideology that white Southern Democrats, Anglo-Saxon Protestants championed. And so you can see a really sort of explicit example of the way that white Southerners understood the difference between the Republican and Democratic parties in that image on the lower left. This is a very common kind of conception of the difference between the Democratic Party, which is seen by Southerners as the one party that is actually there to defend the white man's privilege, defend the white man's role in society. The Republican Party, largely because of its connection to the war, largely because of its connection to the 13th and 14th Amendments, and the 15th when we get to it, Republican Party was seen as the party of the Negro, as it would have been phrased at the time. And so it is very much a question of not just, oh, how do you feel about one party's views on the tariff or military spending or that kind of thing. White Southerners typically boil everything down to the question of race. And the Republican Party gets sort of connected with the race question from the Southern perspective, gets connected with that question in the negative way. Ultimately, Reconstruction is going to draw to a close. How does that happen? Well, partly it's a result of the fact that those former Confederate states begin to rejoin the Union, right? So you've got the list there. The first one is Tennessee in July of 1866, so not very long after the end of the war. Excuse me, just over a year after the conclusion of the war. The last one is Georgia, which is going to be about 4 years after that. So partially Reconstruction is losing steam because those states are being readmitted into the Union. Partially it is losing steam because, by all appearances at least, the Republican Party is managing to acquire constitutional amendments that will supposedly protect civil rights and equality for the future. So you've got the 13th Amendment banning slavery, you've got the 14th Amendment establishing due process and equal protection, and then you've got the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in 1870, which in theory guarantees suffrage, right, the right to vote, to African American men. And so that certainly is not comprehensive. There were really blatant voting restrictions all the way into the 1960s and 70s. Today, there are returning attempts at restricting voting opportunities in a lot of different, even more insidious ways. And so it's not as though these questions have been solved completely, right? Unfortunately, they are still there. Unfortunately, it's hard to say how and when those kinds of issues will be finally rooted out and killed off once and for all. But in terms of Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment seemingly ends the last remaining area where civil rights is still not fully realized at the time. In 1872, the federal government passes a law that grants a pardon to all of the Confederacy's political and military leadership. Otherwise, this would have been a nightmare of trying to punish military and political leaders of the Confederacy, because these people were traitors, and generally speaking, treason is punishable by execution. And so the government needed to figure out a solution there. And so largely Northerners, especially members of the Republican Party, and the voting blocs that support them, start to lose interest, right? As they see it, the war is now 5, 6, 7+ years old. They are not that interested in maintaining the military occupation that Reconstruction involves. It's expensive. There are other things to worry about. That time has passed. And so the Democratic Party starts to regain quite a bit of power in Southern politics, often at the expense of the Republican Party, that is increasingly kind of stepping aside and stepping back during the early 1870s. The thing that finally puts the nail in the coffin of Reconstruction, though, comes as a result of the election of 1876. And 1876 is a presidential election, and it is Samuel Tilden of New York State, who's a Democrat, running against Rutherford B. Hayes, who's a Republican out of Ohio. And long story short, what happens here is when there is a presidential election, each state has to send electoral results to Congress. And those are the results then that officially determine who is president. In 1876, 3 southern states end up sending 2 different sets of returns to Congress. And so the question then becomes, which one is accurate? Which of those 2 sets of returns is the correct and accurate one? And if Tilden, who was otherwise leading in the Electoral College, if Tilden had gotten 1 vote from those 3 states, he would be president. Hayes would have needed all of the votes from those 3 states in order to be named president. Congress then has to make a decision about which votes to award to which person. And so they set up a commission, and this commission then determines what's called the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise of 1877 gives the presidency to Hayes. They say, we're going to make Rutherford Hayes president of the United States. And in sort of backroom negotiations, it comes out that Hayes has basically agreed that if he becomes president, and the Republican Party and Democratic Party have signed off on this, if Hayes becomes president, he will remove the last military presence in the South, because part of Reconstruction involved an occupation by the United States Army. So Hayes says, all right, I'm going to take that remaining military presence out of those southern states, and I will sort of step aside. I will instruct the Republican Party to kind of step aside to allow the Democratic Party to win the governorship of Florida and South Carolina. And so altogether, this is going to basically once and for all end Reconstruction. It obviously doesn't solve the issues in some respects that Reconstruction was really centered on. So those things are going to last all the way into the 20th, and in some cases, all the way into the 21st centuries. But it does provide at least a stopping point, right, for Reconstruction. And it does, in many ways, point to a moment of transition between the world, the American world of the 19th century, and what will pretty quickly be pointing towards the American world of the 20th century. So that is the end of the Reconstruction material. Again, if any of those things are confusing, here again, there are some really, really important things. The 14th Amendment, the Compromise of 1877, those kinds of things, really important and likely to appear on an exam. So if you're confused about any of that, or you just have general questions that you'd like to kind of follow up on, please make sure to let me know, and I will see everybody soon. Hope everybody's doing well. Take care.